For 30 years, America watched Johnny Carson laugh with Hollywood's biggest legends. Night after night, they sat beside him, charming, polished, and adored. But when the cameras went dark, Johnny saw something else entirely. This is not the version of Hollywood you grew up with. Alone on his yacht off Catalina Island, Johnny looks back on the men the world worshipped and the private behavior that shattered their images. A velvet-gloved tyrant, a comedy saint who demanded worship, a legend who stole jokes, dignity, and respect, a smiling moral authority hiding something far darker. These are not rumors or tabloid myths. These are the memories Johnny kept quiet, until now, and once you hear them, you'll never see these icons the same way again. Chapter 1. Frank Sinatra, the Velvet-Gloved Tyrant. On the yacht Serengeti, anchored quietly off the coast of Catalina Island, Johnny Carson sat stretched out on the deck, gazing at pink clouds slowly dissolving into the dying sunset. The ocean was calm, almost reverent, and a cool sea breeze moved gently through his silver hair. Yet inside Johnny's mind, there was no peace. Memories of blinding studio lights, tense countdowns, and the faces of Hollywood's most powerful men surged relentlessly, rising and crashing like ocean waves. He lifted his glass, took a slow sip of wine, and shook his head with faint disbelief, thinking about the men the world celebrated as gentlemen, men praised for charm and class, but whose true natures he could only summarize with one unforgiving word: scumbags. The first name to surface in his thoughts was inevitable: Frank Sinatra. To the public, Frank was the voice, an angelic singer whose sound defined an era, the living symbol of elegance wrapped in wrinkle-free tailored suits and effortless cool. But in Johnny's unpublished notes, Sinatra appeared as something entirely different. There, Frank emerged as an uncrowned king, a man ruled by authoritarian instincts and corrosive arrogance. Johnny recalled that whenever Sinatra appeared at the Tonight Show studio, the space instantly stopped being a place of relaxed entertainment and transformed into a mob boss's royal inspection. Frank never arrived casually. He came flanked by an aggressive entourage, men who glared openly at anyone who dared block their path or made the mistake of looking the chairman directly in the eye. Doing a show with Frank, Johnny once said, felt like dancing across a minefield. Sinatra was painfully sensitive, easily angered if even the smallest detail failed to align with his expectations. He imposed unreasonable rules, demanded to pre-approve every question, and absolutely forbade any mention of uncomfortable subjects, including dark spots in his private life or rumors about his alleged connections to the underworld. Johnny still vividly remembers moments on live television when a joke landed slightly offbeat and Frank responded instantly with a bone-chilling glare. It was a silent threat, a form of psychological pressure so heavy it made even a seasoned professional like Johnny feel trapped and suffocated in his own chair. Yet what truly convinced Johnny that Frank was a scumbag wasn't how he treated fellow stars, but how he treated the invisible people behind the scenes. With lingering indignation still visible on his face, Johnny recalled Sinatra's imperious attitude towards sound technicians, makeup artists, and runners, treating them as if they were disposable servants. He once witnessed Frank brutally berate a young lighting technician who accidentally bumped a light stand near Sinatra. Instead of offering a gentle correction, Frank unleashed humiliating language that crushed the young man's self-esteem before the entire crew. To Johnny, that moment exposed the truth. It was the act of a bully, at odds with the gallant gentleman image Frank worked obsessively to project. The cruelty extended into bizarre technical demands. Johnny remembered a night when Sinatra demanded the entire studio lighting system be changed just minutes before cameras rolled because he believed the light emphasized his wrinkles. Dozens of crew members scrambled to exhaustion, racing to satisfy that narcissism without receiving a single please or thank you. Frank viewed their labor as a given, an obligation owed to a star of his stature. Johnny also noticed Sinatra's mastery of manipulating loyalty. Frank could call you a good brother one day, praising you loudly, but if you crossed him even slightly, he would quietly use every tentacle of his power in Hollywood to isolate and crush your career. The space around Frank Sinatra never held warmth. It radiated submission and fear. Johnny watched colleagues bow their heads in silence, afraid to speak up against Frank's behavior for fear of retaliation from the chairman's long reach. Many times, sitting in the host chair, Johnny wanted to invite Frank to leave the studio immediately just to protect his staff's dignity and honor. But Sinatra's immense influence over the American public at the time became an invisible barrier, forcing Johnny to swallow his pride for the greater good of the show. Those nights left Johnny utterly exhausted, having to shake hands and smile with a man he knew possessed a deeply toxic character. In reflection, Johnny concluded that Frank Sinatra was the clearest proof that extraordinary talent can hide a petty, cruel soul. As the sun dipped behind the Catalina Mountains, Johnny took a final sip of wine, leaving the deck wrapped in thoughtful silence. Frank had a voice that could touch heaven, he muttered softly, but his personality dragged people straight to hell. As the lights of Catalina began to twinkle in the distance, Johnny closed the memory with a decisive thought. He owed his staff an apology for the humiliation they endured, and now, at last, the truth deserved to be returned to its rightful place. Chapter 2. Jerry Lewis, the crown built on applause. Johnny Carson remained seated on the deck, a thin blanket pulled over his lap to ward off the growing chill of the sea breeze. After recounting the story of Frank Sinatra, a heavier, more somber mood settled over him. He leaned back slightly, lit a cigarette, and watched as the white smoke dissolved quickly into the open air. When he spoke the next name, the corner of his mouth twitched, an expression that mixed respect for undeniable talent with deep wariness toward character. If Frank Sinatra had been a cold, calculating storm, Johnny said quietly, then this man was an uncontrollable wildfire. The subject of this chapter was Jerry Lewis, celebrated by the public as the king of comedy, yet remembered by Johnny as a tyrant once the curtain fell. Johnny Carson recalled the years when Jerry Lewis stood at the absolute peak of his fame. On screen, Jerry was a genius of physical comedy, capable of making millions erupt in laughter with nothing more than a crooked walk, a wild grimace, or a perfectly timed collapse. Audiences saw chaos, innocence, and brilliance wrapped up in childish energy. But Johnny remembered that the second the studio lights went dark, that funny kid vanished instantly. In his place stood a grumpy, dictatorial man who looked down on everyone around him. To Johnny, Jerry Lewis wasn't simply a difficult guest. He was the clearest example of a man whose ego had swollen so large that there was no room left for compassion or humility. At the Tonight Show studio, the mere appearance of Jerry Lewis's name on the schedule sent a ripple of tension through the staff. From camera operators to backstage assistants, everyone felt it. Jerry never entered the green room with a smile or a greeting. He walked in as if he owned the entire television network, treating everyone else as cheap props placed there to serve his greatness. Johnny recalled with sadness witnessing Jerry brutally scold subordinates for the smallest mistakes, whether it was bringing the wrong kind of coffee or placing a chair a few inches out of position. Jerry Lewis's scumbaggery, in Johnny's view, lay in his demand for absolute worship. Jerry didn't want to be treated like an artist or even a star. He wanted to be treated like a saint. Johnny remembered sitting across from Jerry during live broadcasts, feeling tension radiate from him like heat. Jerry constantly tried to overshadow the host, interrupting conversations and making demeaning jokes at others' expenses simply to elevate himself. Johnny had to rely on every ounce of patience and professionalism to keep the show from collapsing into a one-man performance fueled by Jerry's smug self-adoration. What disturbed Johnny most, however, was the hypocrisy surrounding Jerry Lewis's public image as a philanthropist. For decades, Jerry had been the face of televised charity events raising money for disabled children, appearing on screen with tears in his eyes and words overflowing with compassion. Yet Johnny recalled that the moment Jerry stepped away from the camera, he spoke with cruelty and contempt about the very people he had just claimed to champion. The contrast between the saintly exterior and the rotten interior made Johnny feel physically sick. He couldn't understand how a man could live such a perfectly divided double life. Backstage, Jerry Lewis was a nightmare to manage. His demands were endless, and his temper flared instantly if anything failed to satisfy him. Johnny remembered one night when Jerry demanded that a young costume assistant be fired simply because she accidentally wrinkled the hem of his jacket. Johnny had to personally intervene to save her job, an act that earned him a glare of pure hatred from Jerry that lingered for years afterwards. To Jerry, other people's dignity meant nothing if it interfered with his warped sense of perfection. Johnny also recalled how Jerry treated his peers. Instead of encouraging young comedians, Jerry viewed them as threats waiting to steal his spotlight. He routinely mocked emerging talent, making cruel comments about their abilities in shared spaces where everyone could hear. That insecurity poisoned the atmosphere around him, filling it with jealousy and hostility. To Johnny, a true comedian existed to bring joy, not fear and misery, to the people around him. Sitting quietly on the deck of the Serengeti, Johnny Carson sighed as he studied the ash at the end of his cigarette. He felt genuine pity for Jerry's wasted potential. Jerry Lewis could have been remembered as a complete legend if he hadn't allowed narcissism to rot his character from the inside out. Jerry had fame, money, and endless public admiration, but he lacked the one thing that mattered most: respect for his fellow man. His promiscuity, Johnny thought, was not of the body, but of an oversized ego that left him isolated, a lonely island surrounded by people who once loved him. Johnny closed the memory of Jerry Lewis with a quiet reflection. A person can play the good guy on screen for a lifetime, but true character is only revealed when the cameras shut off and when they deal with those who have nothing to offer in return. Chapter 3. Milton Berle, the spotlight hoarder of television. The night over Catalina Bay grew noticeably quieter, leaving behind only the steady sound of waves brushing against the hull of the Serengeti and the low whistle of wind threading through the masts. Johnny Carson pulled the thin blanket tighter around his shoulders, squinting slightly beneath the dim yellow glow of the deck lights. After unburdening himself of memories involving the imperious storm named Frank Sinatra and the suffocating dictatorship of Jerry Lewis, Johnny felt himself drifting into another sea of recollection. This one carried the name of a man whose mere mention left him both physically and mentally exhausted. Johnny lifted a mug of hot ginger tea, sipping slowly and letting the warmth settle into his chest before beginning the story of Uncle Milty, the legend known to America as Milton Berle. In the history of American television, Milton Berle was worshipped as Mr. Television, the man credited with convincing millions of families to buy their very first TV sets just to watch him perform. To the public, he was a pioneer, a king. But to Johnny Carson, Milton Berle was not a monarch deserving respect. He was a professional robber, a man who lived to steal the spotlight in the crudest way imaginable. Johnny believed Milton's scumbaggery stemmed from a greedy ego bordering on the pathological. Milton never accepted the idea that he was merely a guest. He wanted to be the sun, and everyone else, including the host, had to exist as tiny planets, orbiting and worshiping him. Johnny recalled that every time Milton Berle appeared on The Tonight Show, it felt like a battle for survival. Milton didn't understand the concept of listening. He entered the studio with a massive cigar clamped between his lips and a mouth that never stopped moving. He constantly interrupted Johnny, hijacked punchlines, and forcefully turned interviews into his own rambling stand-up routines. Johnny remembered, with weary restraint, watching Milton casually cut into other guests' important moments, completely destroying the rhythm and grace of the show just to squeeze in a stale joke of his own. In Hollywood, Milton Berle carried another nickname spoken quietly behind closed doors: the joke thief. Johnny confirmed the reputation was entirely deserved. Milton had a shameless habit of attending small comedy clubs, watching young emerging comedians perform, and writing down their best material. Weeks later, those same jokes would appear on national television, delivered by Milton as if they were his own creations. Johnny had seen young artists crying backstage, knowing a year's worth of creative effort had been stolen and repackaged by a powerful figure in just a few minutes on air. To Johnny, this wasn't merely unethical. It was the behavior of a selfish man willing to trample on other people's futures to keep his own spotlight burning. Milton's arrogance also revealed itself in his complete disregard for personal boundaries. Johnny recalled, with irritation, how Milton frequently barged into other guests' dressing rooms without knocking, interrupting their preparations just to boast of his past achievements. Milton didn't care if someone was tired, nervous, or concentrating. He needed an audience, and he would force anyone into that role. Johnny remembered having to personally ask Milton to leave the makeup room once because he wouldn't stop bothering an actress preparing for an emotionally demanding scene. Backstage, Milton Berle was notoriously difficult to please. He believed he was always the smartest person in the room. He criticized production decisions, complained endlessly about lighting angles, and demanded constant adjustments to ensure he appeared most prominent on camera. Johnny also recalled Milton's deeply condescending attitude toward the writing staff. He routinely dismissed their clever suggestions, replacing them with tired routines from the 1940s, then blamed the writers when the audience failed to laugh. Greed for attention had blinded Milton to reality. He failed to realize that the world had changed and that his style had grown outdated. What disturbed Johnny most, however, was Milton's total lack of respect for the host's role. In the talk show world, there existed an unspoken rule: a guest never steps on the host. Milton shattered that rule with ease. He treated Johnny like a clueless rookie in need of correction. Johnny recalled one live broadcast where Milton patted him on the head like a child and ordered him to be quiet so he could continue a long, self-indulgent story. In that moment, Johnny had to summon every ounce of professionalism he possessed not to hurl the pen in his hand straight at the so-called legend. Sitting aboard the Serengeti, Johnny Carson exhaled sharply, his gaze fixed on the deep black water stretching endlessly beyond the deck. He realized that Milton Berle's scumbaggery was rooted in a profound fear of being forgotten. Milton loved the stage lights so desperately that he was willing to become rude, predatory, and cruel just to stay visible. Yet that very desperation pushed colleagues away, leaving him increasingly isolated. Johnny concluded that Milton Berle was a giant in career, but painfully small in character. A man who built his empire from scraps of light stolen from others. The sea breeze felt colder now. Johnny pulled the blanket closer and closed the chapter on Uncle Milty, preparing himself for the next name, one even more smug and far more contemptuous of women. Chapter 4. Burt Reynolds. Johnny Carson leaned back into the worn leather armchair, his posture relaxed but his expression distant, eyes fixed on the flickering lights of other ships scattered across the dark water. After unloading the memory of a spotlight thief like Milton Berle, he let out a soft sigh. The familiar, sharp smile that once defined him faded, replaced by a look edged with quiet contempt as he prepared to speak the next name. This man hadn't stolen jokes or interrupted for attention. Instead, he brought a different kind of pressure into the room. Pressure born of extreme narcissism and an attitude Johnny could only describe as cheap, casual misogyny. This was the masculinity icon of the 1970s, Burt Reynolds. Johnny Carson remembered the years when Burt Reynolds was the biggest star on the planet, with his signature mustache, confident smirk, and effortless swagger. Burt often appeared on The Tonight Show, presented to the audience as one of Johnny's closest friends. Viewers adored him. They went wild for his rugged charm and dusty outlaw appeal. But Johnny recalled that behind the laughter and playful on-air banter lived a very different man. Burt didn't simply see himself as the center of the universe. He believed everyone around him, especially women, existed to orbit his manufactured glamour. Burt Reynolds' scumbaggery, in Johnny's words, began the moment he stepped into the guest green room. While most stars entered with politeness, or at least restraint, Burt walked in as if he owned the entire television station. Johnny recalled with irritation Burt's pathological obsession with his appearance. He could spend hours forcing makeup artists to adjust every strand of hair on his expensive toupee. And if anyone accidentally revealed they knew he wore a wig, Burt's mood shifted instantly. He became aggressive, sarcastic, and cruel. To Johnny, a real man never uses power to bully costume staff, simply out of fear of aging. But what truly turned Johnny's stomach was Burt's behavior toward female guests. Johnny recounted that whenever a beautiful woman appeared on the same episode, Burt made it his mission to reduce her to decoration or the target of crude jokes. Johnny witnessed Burt making unwanted physical contact and brazen flirtations in full view of backstage staff, leaving female colleagues visibly uncomfortable and humiliated. More than once, Johnny had to deliberately steer conversations away to protect a guest's dignity, while Burt laughed as though it were his divine right as a so-called masculine icon. In interviews, Burt's narcissism frequently erupted without restraint. He didn't listen to Johnny's questions so much as wait impatiently for his turn to talk. Once given the floor, he launched into long monologues praising himself or recounting his romantic conquests. Johnny remembered with weary frustration how Burt could talk endlessly about seducing one woman, discarding another, all with cold satisfaction. To Johnny, this wasn't the carefree confidence of a playboy. It was the selfishness of a man who treated other people's feelings as disposable entertainment. Burt showed little interest in the emotional damage he left behind. He only cared about how each story enhanced his legend. Johnny recalled a notorious moment on live television when Burt dumped an entire can of whipped cream over another guest's head for a cheap laugh. The studio erupted in laughter, but Johnny noticed something else. He saw anger and humiliation flicker across the victim's face. Backstage, instead of offering a sincere apology, Burt shrugged it off as entertainment art. That absence of basic respect disgusted Johnny more than any joke ever could. Burt treated people as tools, and if humiliating someone earned him a moment of spotlight, he did it without hesitation. Burt's oversized ego also made him an enemy of truth. Johnny recalled that Burt routinely fabricated stories about his career and personal life to inflate his myth. When Johnny gently challenged those exaggerations on air, Burt's demeanor changed instantly. His charm hardened into sarcasm, and he used cutting remarks to undermine the credibility of anyone who questioned him. Burt Reynolds' scumbaggery, Johnny believed, lay in his absolute refusal to admit mistakes and his habit of treating any feedback as a personal attack. Every interaction felt like walking near a man bristling with invisible spikes, desperate to protect a fragile shell of self-esteem. Johnny Carson took a small sip of wine, the bitterness lingering on his tongue, mirroring the taste of the memories themselves. With time and distance, Johnny realized that Burt Reynolds' charm was nothing more than a thin layer of paint applied over a hollow core filled with contempt. Burt had spent his entire life crafting the image of a chivalrous Western gentleman. In reality, he was a snob who never learned how to respect women or anyone he considered weaker than himself. Johnny concluded that Burt Reynolds was a man rich in money and fame, but profoundly poor in character. Seabreeze strengthened, causing the old pages of Johnny's notebook to flip softly. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying himself before calling the next name. A man so cold and dismissive that every interview with him felt less like a conversation and more like an ordeal. Chapter 5. Charles Bronson. Silence sharpened into insult. Johnny Carson continued his story without lifting his gaze from the dark water. He pulled the thin blanket higher around his shoulders, squinting slightly beneath the dim yellow glow of the deck lights. After unloading the exhausting memories of a spotlight thief like Milton Berle and the smug bravado of Burt Reynolds, Johnny felt himself drifting into a colder, harsher region of recollection. He raised his mug, sipped the hot ginger tea, and let the warmth sink slowly into his chest before speaking the name of the man he privately called Hollywood's emotionless rock. This man didn't interrupt, he wasn't loud, he didn't steal jokes or demand worship. Instead, he brought something far worse, silent contempt. That man was the star of the Death Wish films, Charles Bronson. Johnny Carson recalled the 1970s when Bronson stood as the undisputed icon of grit, masculinity, and icy coolness on screen. With a face carved like stone and eyes that seemed permanently hardened by violence, Bronson mesmerized audiences as the embodiment of the lone avenger. This man spoke little and acted decisively. But to Johnny, once the Tonight Show studio lights blazed, that coolness revealed itself not as an acting choice, but as deliberate rudeness. Johnny recounted that throughout his hosting career, interviewing Charles Bronson was the most exhausting and miserable experience he'd ever endured. Bronson didn't regard being a guest as an honor, let alone a professional obligation. He treated it like an inconvenience, a reluctant favor bestowed upon the show. Bronson's scumbaggery, in Johnny's view, lay in an uncooperative attitude that bordered on outright insult. Every time Bronson appeared, the atmosphere in the studio shifted instantly. The air grew thick and tense. Johnny tried earnestly to ask thoughtful questions, opening doors for discussion about craft, life, or motivation. Bronson responded with curt answers, yes, no, or worse, long stretches of hostile silence paired with a challenging stare. To Johnny, this wasn't the humility of a man of few words. It was the arrogance of someone trying to prove he was too important, too serious to participate in light conversation. Johnny remembered the sensation of wrestling in the host chair, struggling to drag even a single sentence out of Bronson. On live television, these silences stretched painfully long, making the audience visibly uncomfortable. Bronson made no effort to help the show succeed. He sat rigid and unmoving, staring at Johnny as though he were an irritating insect. Johnny felt professionally insulted. He believed that when someone accepted an appearance fee and used the platform to promote a film, that person had a responsibility to contribute something meaningful. Bronson refused. Worse, Johnny sensed he enjoyed the discomfort. He took pleasure in turning the interview into an endurance test, slow-motion torture. Backstage, Bronson's behavior was no better. Johnny recalled his face tightening with lingering anger that Bronson never greeted anyone, not assistants, not makeup artists, not production staff. He moved through the studio with a menacing, dismissive expression, brushing off any suggestions regarding scripts, timing, or camera angles. On one occasion, a young female staff member was reduced to tears simply because Bronson responded to a polite request with open contempt. To Johnny, a real man, never used silence or coldness as a weapon against people trying to help him do his job. Johnny also noticed Bronson's clear disdain for the audience itself. While most stars expressed gratitude to the public for their support, Bronson behaved as if the fans were beneath his notice. He rarely smiled, never waved, and appeared eager to end tapings as quickly as possible so he could leave. Beneath that stone-faced masculinity, Johnny sensed something deeply narcissistic. Bronson admired himself so completely that there was no room left for anyone else, including the people who bought tickets to see his movies. Bronson's scumbaggery lay in accepting all the glory while despising the very path that created it. Johnny shared a final backstage realization. Charles Bronson was extremely sensitive about his image, but not in a confident way. He wanted to be worshipped as dangerous, yet lacked the confidence to converse normally. Johnny came to believe that Bronson's rudeness was a shield, hiding an inner emptiness. With little to say and nowhere to go, he chose silence and intimidation so no one would discover how unremarkable he truly was. That calculated coldness made him the most disliked guest in the show's history. Johnny closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself before moving on. The next name belonged to a man who once ruled everything around him, only to meet an ending as controversial as his arrogance. Chapter 6. Chevy Chase. Brilliance undone by arrogance. Mist slowly settled around the Serengeti, wrapping the deck in a hazy, cold veil that matched Johnny Carson's mood. He poured himself a little more brandy, the ice clinking sharply against the glass, like a warning bell echoing through the quiet night. Leaning against the ship's railing, Johnny stared into the darkness, his eyes reflecting a sharp glint of sarcasm mixed with something colder. If men like Sinatra had filled him with tension, and figures like Bronson had left him drained, the next name stirred a very different feeling. This one made him feel vindicated. The man was Chevy Chase, someone Johnny had once publicly mocked as living proof that raw talent cannot redeem a terrible personality. Johnny recalled the years when Chevy Chase stood at the peak of fame with Saturday Night Live. He didn't enter the Tonight Show studio like a guest grateful for an invitation. He walked in like a superior, as though the show existed to honor his presence. Chevy was infamous throughout Hollywood for his cruelty behind the scenes. Johnny remembered, with open disdain, hearing Chevy unleash vicious insults about the looks and abilities of stagehands, Treating them like disposable tools meant only to obey orders. There were no limits to Chevy's arrogance. He believed himself the lone genius in a world of fools, convinced that everyone around him was intellectually inferior. Yet what etched itself deepest into Johnny Carson's memory wasn't Chevy's smug interviews, though those were exhausting enough. It was the moment Chevy decided to abandon acting and launch his own late-night talk show, directly competing with Johnny. Johnny took a sip of his drink, a faint smirk tugging at his lips as he remembered Chevy's bold declaration that he would redefine late-night television. Chevy genuinely believed he could easily dethrone the king. Then came the fall. Chevy Chase's talk show collapsed almost instantly, becoming a historic failure, and was canceled after only a few weeks. Ratings were abysmal, and his toxic behavior toward the crew made the environment unbearable. Johnny admitted that when he heard the news of the show's cancellation, he felt a rare, guilty sensation. It wasn't jealousy. It was the sharp feeling of justice finally catching up. "That's the price," Johnny muttered toward the dark sea, for a man who always thought he was smarter than God. Johnny even publicly satirized Chevy's failure on television, something he rarely did to a fellow entertainer. But with Chevy, he felt it was necessary. He wanted him to understand that hosting wasn't just about sharp wit or fast jokes. It required humility, generosity, and a genuine human connection, qualities Chevy never possessed. To Johnny, Chevy's downfall was an expensive lesson in karma. When you use fame to trample others, fame has a way of turning back on you when you fall. Johnny pulled his coat tighter against the cold, preparing himself for the final chapter. He knew this list would never be complete without one final name, a man America adored as a perfect father figure. But behind that gentle smile lived a hypocritical monster whose moral preaching made Johnny physically sick. Number 7. Bill Cosby. Virtue worn like a disguise. Dawn hovered just beyond the horizon of Catalina Island, staining the murmuring sea a deep, uneasy purple. Johnny Carson capped the empty wine bottle and set it aside, his eyes heavy with fatigue but sharpened by thought. He had already spoken 6 names, 6 polished faces hiding something rotten underneath. Yet this final name made him shudder differently, not because of rage or cruelty in plain sight, but because of deception perfected to an art. That name was Bill Cosby. To millions of Americans, Bill Cosby was America's dad, the genuine Dr. Huxtable wrapped in colorful sweaters, dispensing wisdom about family, education, and clean living. But aboard the Serengeti, alone with the ocean and his memories, Johnny Carson wrote words filled with quiet contempt. He believed that if there was an award for playing a decent man, Bill Cosby deserved it daily, because the man he became once the camera shut off was, in Johnny's eyes, the most terrifying, hypocritical tyrant he'd ever encountered. Johnny recalled the times Bill Cosby appeared on The Tonight Show. Transformation was instant. The moment the on-air light went dark, Cosby's warm smile vanished so quickly it startled people nearby, replaced by a cold, measuring stare. Cosby's scumbaggery, Johnny believed, lived in his habit of preaching down to others. He didn't see the studio staff as colleagues. He saw them as misbehaving children in need of a correction. Johnny remembered with deep discomfort how Cosby would roam backstage delivering unsolicited sermons. He criticized a cameraman's clothing, mocked an assistant's hairstyle, or raised his voice to lecture a writer about how to live correctly. He moved like a self-appointed saint, handing out moral judgments no one asked for. The atmosphere around him became suffocating, weighed down by constant evaluation and judgment. Cosby wanted obedience, reverence, and submission to his carefully crafted image of perfection. What disgusted Johnny most was his instinctive sense that something false lived behind that polished surface. He admitted that every time he looked into Cosby's eyes, he didn't see warmth or kindness, but calculation and something dark and hollow. Cosby's speeches about morality, family values, and discipline sounded to Johnny like empty slogans, rehearsed lines meant to conceal something decaying beneath the surface. Johnny felt personally insulted watching a man he believed wasn't clean place himself on a moral pedestal and lecture others on how to live clean lives. One incident stayed with him. Johnny witnessed Cosby berate a staff member simply for laughing a little too loudly during a break. Cosby framed his cruelty as professionalism and discipline. using heavy, moralistic language to crush the person's confidence. Johnny had to step in to protect his staff. The look Cosby shot back at him was unforgettable. It was a look of simmering hostility, the glare of a man who believed he stood above ordinary rules, above accountability, above common morality. As the first rays of morning light spread across the deck, Johnny Carson slowly closed his notebook. His blacklist was complete. From Sinatra's aggression to Cosby's hypocrisy, he realized that Hollywood's so-called golden age had been layered with thick coats of deception. Bill Cosby was the perfect final entry, a reminder that the most frightening monsters are not always loud or violent. Sometimes they smile warmly and speak endlessly about virtue. Johnny rose to his feet and stretched, welcoming the cool sea breeze, feeling lighter, as though he had finally dropped 1,000-pound weight he'd carried for decades. The ugliest secrets had been spoken aloud to the open ocean. Johnny gently closed the worn leather notebook and left the ghosts of the past behind him. He understood that glamour could deceive the public for a time, but time itself remained the fairest judge of character. The gods people worshipped, once stripped of makeup and dragged down from pedestals of fame, were often just flawed humans, sometimes warped beyond recognition. Johnny looked out over the water one last time. Were these revelations shocking? Which of the 7 names cut deepest? He knew the answers would live on in those willing to look past the shine. If you've watched the video till here, that means you've enjoyed the video. Subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notifications bell icon